Important issue right now in America than policing. And this panel is going to be addressing the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. We're going to have a number of panelists, and we will introduce them in just a moment. But right now, it is our honor and privilege to have the sponsor or one of the sponsors of the bill in the United States Congress, the Honorable Karen Bass, representative from the 37th Congressional District in California, to talk to us and tell us a little bit about the bill.
Hello. Let me thank the Reverend for such a kind introduction and congratulate you for your leadership over many decades. The National Action Network has made a profound difference in our country, and I know it will continue to until we achieve racial, social, and economic justice. And thank you so much for this panel today on the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Let me just talk a brief minute about the bill. First of all, the most important part of the bill holds police officers accountable. We watched when Derek Chauvin was murdering George Floyd with his knee on his neck, looking at that camera with his hand in his pocket, acting like he had complete impunity, because up until the passage of this bill, frankly, he does. We need to hold officers accountable. They need to be sued if they hurt us, if they kill us. They need to be prosecuted. The standard to prosecute an officer is so high right now, we have to prove what was in their mind. We need to say that that knee on the neck for 9 minutes, we learned, is reckless, and he should be accountable, and that was murder. There are 18,000 police departments in the United States and no national standards, no accreditation. You have to have accreditation to have your hair cut, but not to be a police officer. And then we need to provide resources to communities so communities can re-envision policing, because we know that over the last few decades we have wiped out, damaged, left our safety net in tatters. And so when things fall through the cracks, we leave it to police officers to pick up the pieces. Police officers shouldn't have to deal with mental health issues. People in a mental health crisis, when family members call the police for help, they shouldn't worry about the police coming in and killing their relative. And so we need to refund our communities. We need to rebuild our safety net. We need to put our resources in health, in social, and in economic programs. And so the bill provides grants to communities to re-envision policing. Now we need to get the bill passed out of the Senate. So I am hoping that the National Action Network, during your conference, will help to mobilize, help to bring out the pressure. The reason we had the bill in Congress last year was because of the hundreds of thousands of people that were out on the street and demanded change. And so I hope that the National Action Network will continue in your tradition to build that movement, to pressure the Senate, to make sure that we get that bill on President Biden's desk ASAP. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your invitation to speak with you today.
All right. Let's give a big hand to the Honorable Karen Bass, representative of the 37th Congressional District in California. So we do have a tremendous panel, brothers and sisters, and you know, there really is no more important issue confronting our nation right now than the issue of policing. And as the Congresswoman just said, there will be a battle to get this act past Congress. And sometimes, and some of you were here for the panel this morning with the mothers of the movement, and one of the things when you think about the mothers of the movement and some of what they said is their endurance. Because when you think about the fight for justice and getting these bills through the Congress, it's not about it happening today or tomorrow. It's not about now. It's about how long can you endure in the fight to make sure these things happen, and that's what we are about, and that's what many of the people you will hear today speak about. It is truly ironic when you think about the Michael Brown situation in Ferguson, Missouri. horrible situation. Everything about that situation said it was willful on the part of the police officer, but he could not get justice, either state or federal. Eric Garner, we watched Eric Garner on tape get strangled to death, but no prosecution on the state level, and on the federal level, there was a fight between the Justice Department in Washington, D.C., and the Eastern District in New York over whether or not they could establish the willfulness for there to be a successful prosecution. And at the end of the day, there was no prosecution in Eric Garner. So that's why we are fighting for this act. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act is critical to the fight to make a more perfect union with regard to policing in America. We're so pleased today to have on the panel with us Chief Sherilyn C.J. Davis. She's from the Durham Police Department. She's been there for 32 years, dedicated service in law enforcement. She began her career with the Atlanta Police Department, where she learned the essential elements of community engagement and relationship building as a young officer. There she rose through the ranks and eventually became the chief of police for the city of Durham. We welcome her and happy to have her with us this morning. We also want to welcome Jerika Richardson. She's the Senior Vice President for Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives for the National Urban League. She leads the organization's advocacy and public education and strategic work on civic engagement, police reform, criminal justice reform, and other justice-related issues. Previously, Ms. Richardson was Deputy Executive Director and Senior Advisor to the Secretary to the Board for the nation's largest independent police oversight agency, the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board. Let's give Jerika a big welcome. And we also want to welcome, and he is here live and in color, as they say, Dr. Takoy Porter. He is the president of our National Action Network Sacramento chapter, senior pastor of the Genesis Church in Sacramento, and we are pleased and happy to have Dr. Porter with us today. Let's welcome all of them. So we will kick it off. I will start by asking Chief Davis. Chief, please say hello to everybody and just give us some initial thoughts on this very important topic.
Well, good afternoon, Mr. Hardy and distinguished panelists, and definitely to Reverend Sharpton and the Honorable Karen Bass and Nan. Thank you for giving us an opportunity, Noble, for always being a part of these very critical conversations. Today, we all hurt once again. We are all very frustrated and perplexed as we mourn the tragic death of another African-American male, Dante Wright, at the hands of the police. So while Noble has been very, very active and engaged in reform efforts, we all know it's not enough. There's still much work to be done, as it was said earlier by Senator Booker. There's much work to be done, but we just appreciate this opportunity that you all are leading in this dialogue and providing a platform for our voices, the voices of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, to be heard at this very painful but pivotal time in our nation's history. So thank you very much.
All right. Jerika Richardson, a few words to get us going.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy, Reverend Sharpton, and everyone at the National Action Network, as well as the rest of my colleagues on this distinguished panel. I'm Jerika Richardson, Senior Vice President for Equitable Justice at the National Urban League. And it truly is an honor to be having this conversation at this time. because we all know the history of slavery and its roots in this country, whether we're talking about overseers and slave patrols to black codes and Jim Crow. You know, despite integration, despite a lot of the gains that we've seen with more diversity in law enforcement, for us as people of color, and particularly African Americans, policing has just not been synonymous with public safety. And so I'm really glad that we are taking this moment to talk about this really important piece of legislation, because I think it's one of the tools in our toolkit that we need to really improve the quality of life for civilians and for law enforcement alike.
All right, thank you. Dr. Porter, few words to get us going on this topic.
Yeah, well, good afternoon, and to you all and to those back on the West Coast, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here in New York and with my National Action Network family to discuss this very important and relevant issue of the day. We're seeing news come out all the time in regards to bad policing and police misconduct, and so we definitely need to make sure that we get something passed federally so that we can stop burying our babies, right, and mourning and protesting and get something good happen for our communities. What happens good for our community will benefit all communities, and so I'm glad to be here and to be along with these esteemed panelists. Thank you.
All right. Jericka, let me start with you, and could you outline for us why civil rights organizations like National Action Network and the Urban League support this legislation?
Well, it's for many of the reasons that Representative Bass laid out. We really need a comprehensive approach that tackles accountability, that ends racial profiling, that makes lynching a federal crime, that really gives our communities the opportunity to empower themselves and really redefine what public safety means. And then if we're talking about saving lives, all we have to do is look at George Floyd and Eric Garner and Breonna Taylor, and we really need to fundamentally ban chokeholds and no-knock warrants, because it's killing our community. And I think one of the other things that it's really underscores why we need the comprehensive approach, because right now we don't see equity in the way justice is meted out. If we take a look at the recent reports about the officer involved in the Jacob Blake case and the Jacob Blake incident, he's now back on the job. But if we look back 15 years to the officer in Buffalo, an African-American officer, an African-American woman officer at that, who stepped in, was an upstander, and actually stopped her colleague from putting a chokehold on a civilian, she was fired for that. So what we're really looking for is we're looking for equity and national standards. And I think without them, we can never say that in America, I think we should just stop using the term justice system. We should say legal system, because until we move more comprehensive reform forward, it's still unjust.
That's so true. Chief Davis, you're the past president and now the chief of police in Durham, North Carolina. In May of 2020, Noble put out a statement regarding the murder of George Floyd. It encouraged law enforcement agencies to adopt effective policing policies and training to build community trust. Can you outline those points that Noble made?
So, yes, I can. Thank you again. So in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, Noble quickly began drafting what we believed to be critical police reform recommendations to Congress to consider. We started with 4 major recommendations. But after years of working in this space and understanding the many obstacles that block police reform, to include the systematic, I will say, dismissal of President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force recommendations, we knew that critical and impactful change could only be realized through the legislative process. So last year, during my testimony before the U.S. Senate Committee on the Judiciary, we called for national standards. And Representative Bass, the Honorable Representative Bass, mentioned, we call for national standards, which means that police agencies must adopt policies supported by best practices, national best practices. That effectively puts an end to the buffet or smorgasbord type picking and choosing what policies and practices an agency implements. So we believe that every agency should be held to a standard that effectuates real change in key areas. The banning of chokeholds, prohibiting no-knock warrants, you've heard that, especially on drug offenses, limit qualified immunity, mandate officers to adhere to de-escalation training and those policies, duty to intervene. Duty to intervene was so critical in the George Floyd situation. If the officers were mandated to step in and do something instead of standing around, we would have had a different end. And also to invest in social services and programs that prevent crime and address social injustices. So whether it's diversifying departments, fighting for legislative reform, or implementing community programs, Noble, we're committed to doing the work, to building community trust and leading the change that our nation so desperately needs right now.
All right. Sister Richardson, I'm going to come back to you very quickly. How will the legislation empower our communities to reimagine public safety in an equitable and just way?
Okay. Well, empowering our communities really involves recognizing their values and putting the people who are right now closest to the problem, putting them in power because they're also closest to the solution. It will provide grants for communities. It will create task force and commissions, and it will just really help communities as a whole reimagine and develop concrete, just, and equitable public safety approaches. And so I think we need to give them this power. We need to be able to have them direct where resources go for mental health or guidance counselors in schools, substance abuse programs, a whole host of issues that really need our attention. And we really need to move in a way where we have a unified vision of moving forward because it needs to be a system that really is empowered but is centered on truth.
All right. Dr. Porter, National Action Network over the last 30 years has tirelessly worked on reforming practices of policing. What are some of the critical reform components of policing in this bill?
Well, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act addresses three key areas of reform in which our esteemed panelists have already talked about, but transparency is being one, training, and then accountability. We've talked about the banning the use of chokeholds, and more specifically carotid holds, which are very deadly in itself, but as we've seen with George Floyd, can cause death in itself. And so there's that, then there's the banning the use of no-knock warrants, which we all know what happened in the case of Breonna Taylor, and we know that case, but what about the cases that we don't know that this occurred to? So we're banning the use of no-knock warrants, requiring officers to intervene to prevent abuse. It was just stated upon by the chief, requiring national standards for police departments and officers as well, creating that standard across the board nationally so that it's not just a pick and choose option to how you want to police in a certain state, city, neighborhood. Also, another key component of this bill is restricting police access to weaponry designed specifically for military. I think this is very important because police should not turn our communities into battlefields. Police forces should not act like an occupying force. And we know this to be true, especially in underserved communities, in our brown and black communities. You know, they come in with the tanks and the big guns and all that, just for us, and whom they've sworn to protect and serve. And then there's another key component here that we don't want to overlook, which is changing the use of force standard through the Peace Act. And in California, we're part of the AB 392, which we've named the Stephon Clark Law. And the Peace Act is very similar to what we passed in California, which says that whether it's going to evaluate use of force from whether the force was reasonable to whether it was necessary. So it changes it from reasonable to necessary. Necessary means that another reasonable federal law enforcement officer will objectively conclude under the totality of the circumstances that there was no reasonable alternative to the use of force. What this does is establishes a de-escalation tactic and technique. And again, we're happy to say that California led off in that measure where we changed that necessary, we included necessary into that context in the Stephon Clark Law.
All right. Chief Davis, I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to give you a two-part question. One is, why is it so difficult on the state level to get the kind of enforcement and prosecution of police officers when they do wrong, and which is one of the underlying reasons why so much effort is now going into, as has been historically the case, when you're battling states' rights, to try to get people simply to act right. Why do you think that's so difficult on the local and state level?
Well, I think history sort of speaks to that much of the practices and protocols are so steeped in history and even in support of law enforcement, traditional law enforcement for years. Many states continue to support outdated practices that do not support the rights of individuals and citizens. And certain protections have been on the books for many, many years, and that environment and that climate still exists, and it's very hard to penetrate. It was mentioned earlier about 18,000 law enforcement agencies, but those 18,000 law enforcement agencies are led by individuals that are supported by elected officials. And sometimes it's very, very hard to move that needle at the state level.
And with regard to that then, in terms of the work that you're doing with Noble, how does your organization lead the reform work from the law enforcement perspective to impact the change that we are all seeking?
So since 1976, Noble has really served, even though we are small in number compared to the 18,000, but since 1976, and you think about that era, we've served as a conscience of law enforcement by being committed to justice by action, not just talking about what needs to be done, but trying to effectuate laws to create meaningful change. But as members of minority populations, we feel uniquely positioned to lead in these conversations because the parallel that exists between our history and our profession, there is something to be said about that. When I get up in the morning, I don't wake up with my uniform on. I wake up as an African-American female that's very much in touch with my community, the injustices of the past. And Noble feels that we are in a position where we should push for change. We represent 3,000 members internationally. We are primarily all Black chief executives of law enforcement agencies in the feds, in the state, and in local municipalities, and also law enforcement administrators and criminal justice practitioners. So Noble's put out a couple of publications that we believe are sort of roadmaps. One is under our current president, Linda Williams, is entitled Reimagining Public Safety. It was a task force that was put together, and they published in the last few months a roadmap for communities and their law enforcement agencies to reimagine public safety and make strategic funding decisions. And then another one that I helped sponsor was in partnership with John Jay College. And this was a document about the future of public safety as well, what direction we should go. So even though there are 18,000 law enforcement agencies throughout the nation, Noble has taken some very bold steps to engage leaders outside of our membership. We're trying to touch the leadership in other agencies that don't look like us, because I can control what happens in the city of Durham, but I can't control or influence what happens in small town USA. And, you know, I spoke about the 21st century policing principles, which are based on a foundation of constitutional policing, legitimacy, and procedural justice. These concepts, which promote sweeping changes, are clearly outlined in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. So I believe that we must continue to support legislation like the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and other legislative proposals that ultimately ensure safe and livable communities for people of color.
Yeah, and you know, when you think about constitutional policing, you have to always ask yourself, what is so difficult about that for law enforcement in particular to get with and follow? It really shouldn't be as hard as it has been historically, but the fight continues, and certainly Noble is leading on that issue. Qualified immunity, Sister Richardson, is a court-created restriction, if you will. It was created by the courts. Some say it truly does insulate law enforcement officers who may, in many cases, knowingly violate a constitutional right of a person that they're dealing with. But if it was not technically a known right, they can get qualified immunity with regard to having to, at least in the civil context, be responsible for that conduct. Why is this, in terms of the bill that is now before the Congress in terms of qualified immunity? Certainly National Action Network and the Urban League are organizations that truly support and have fought for and are trying to end qualified immunity. But can you speak to why the legislation is a step in the right direction with engaging on this issue of qualified immunity?
Well, the legislation is definitely a step in the right direction because the one thing that we see over and over again when we talk about the events of 2021 or 2020 or even the years leading up to it was the public's mistrust in the system for the fact that there's a lack of accountability. And while we are looking for more accountability from the courts on the criminal side, the civil component is something that is just as important. You laid out qualified immunity. I think one of the things that we've seen over the years is it acts like absolute immunity. And really ending that is critically important to restore public trust. But it's also important for police officers, for them to understand that there are consequences and repercussions to their actions. Right now, we have civilians in these settlement agreements. Essentially, the public is paying the price for these settlements. And so we really need to have members of law enforcement abide by their oath, really live up to the duty that has been given them. And we need to stop shielding those who are committing misconduct. You know, you should not be shielded for engaging in activity like that, because it's killing folks, it's harming us, it's harming the community. And we're the ones that are really paying the price for that. So there really needs to be some more individual responsibility. And I think the power of the purse and really forcing folks to have to be financially held responsible for their actions is an extremely important step.
All right, thank you. Dr. Porter, as the nation watches the George Floyd, well, I should say the Derek Chauvin trial for the killing of George Floyd, many are filled with dread as we await as we approach the moment when we may see the jury get this case, and of course the jury will have to make a decision and try to reach a verdict. The purpose of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is to make it easier to hold officers accountable for their actions. Hypothetically, had the bill been signed into law before last summer, can you talk about how the components of the bill would impact the trial we have been watching?
Yeah, well, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act changes the standard for prosecuting and convicting officers that unlawfully kill or brutalize people. So current law requires evidence that an officer meant to kill someone or violate their civil right. Thus, we have to try to build up the case of them meaning to do something, meaning to kill someone or for their misconduct. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act calls for prosecution when an officer is reckless and kills someone or violates their civil right. What does this mean? This tells us that whether Derek Chauvin meant to kill George Floyd shouldn't matter. What matters is that George Floyd is dead at the hands of an officer sworn to serve and protect and enforce the law, and those responsible must be held accountable. Also, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act bans chokeholds. We've said this countless of times. So the move that Derek Chauvin used to kill George Floyd will be illegal. That means that George Floyd could be alive today if that was once this bill was enacted. It was enacted before George Floyd tragedy happened. He could be alive today, and we would not even know the name of George Floyd. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act will make it so that Derek Chauvin was facing a federal felony for using a chokehold to kill George Floyd. There's some other things that we have to look at. We've heard about the report to intervene in abuse. The officers standing by watching Derek Chauvin kill George Floyd are also responsible for his death. They are complicit in his death and should be held accountable. And the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act requires training for federal officers on their duty to intervene when they see another officer using excessive force and incentivizes states to do the same. Had the bill been law, all of the officers would have been trained on their duty to intervene, as we have stated before, when Chauvin clearly used excessive force by kneeling on George Floyd's neck for what we now know was over 9 minutes, and they will be penalized for their inaction. Also, I think the other thing that we can look at is that the act makes it so that the public is informed, and this is key, about officers being corrupt, dangerous, and abusive. So there's a transparency there. Since joining the Minnesota Police Department in 2001, Derek Chauvin had at least 17 complaints filed against him. In 2017, Officer Tao was sued for excessive use of force against a man and a woman who was 8 months pregnant, according to the complaint. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act sets up a national database of abusive, racist, violent, and/or corrupt officers so communities can see who they are and prevent them from being hired as officers anywhere else after they are fired. Both of these officers will have been included in the national registry established by the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act.
Right, and this is a fight that, as we said at the top, is not something that's going to happen overnight. We have to be diligent in doing this. There are bills in front of the Congress right now, and so we have to be out on those front lines trying to get those bills through the Congress, because at the end of the day, and as the chief alluded to, policing should be constitutional, should be fair and impartial, and should certainly not be based on race. And so With that said, I want to give our panelists a moment to close us out. We thank you for being with us. Of course, you know, once you get going, the time just kind of shoots by so quick. So I want to give our panelists an opportunity to close us out. And let me just start with you, Chief Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy, again, and thank you to my distinguished panelists. I really appreciate the opportunity. But, you know, the continual cycle of the shocking incidents between police and citizens, it just begs the question of how do we keep ending up here? How is it that we have not moved the needle far enough that these egregious incidents continue to play out over and over again? So I can say that Noble will continue to work towards the day when police executives and civic leadership can stop having to explain away the failures of our profession. I believe that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, it is the perfect start as a national mandate for law enforcement agencies around this country. So again, thank you for allowing us to have an opportunity to have voice on this platform.
All right, Sister Richardson.
Well, thank you all for having me. And I agree with Chief Davis that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act really lays the groundwork for meaningful reforms. But I want to just reiterate to our community and to all those watching that it is the floor, and there is still work that needs to be done. And we need to be engaged both on the state and local level to push forward reforms. And just one quick call to action, because as we think about Dr. King and the fierce urgency of now, we see everything that's happening around us. We have to act. So the National Action Network, the National Urban League, the NAACP, the Legal Defense Fund, and many others really have been banding together around a campaign to ensure that this George Floyd Justice and Policing Act passes in its original form. So please reach out to your senators and encourage them to keep these meaningful reforms. Don't weaken this bill. And you can do that by texting Justice Now to 52886. Again, that's Justice Now to 52886. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and Dr. Porter.
Yes. Well, I just want to say I'm glad to be a part of this organization, the National Action Network, under the leadership of Reverend Al Sharpton, to fight for change in such a bold manner. You know, for far too long, our nation has met the cycle of police brutality and racism with tinkering at the edges instead of real change. And to be clear, we cannot and will not accept an incremental approach to justice, nor go through this cycle over and over again. Just this past week, we have seen tragedy happen again in Minnesota with the murder of 20-year-old Dante Wright by Brooklyn Center police officer Kim Potter, an experienced, quote-unquote experienced officer who couldn't tell the difference between a taser and a gun. Enough is enough. And we are sick and tired of burying our young, protesting in the streets, marching, just to get fair policing in our communities. We have to transform the culture of policing to help save lives. And now is the time to take this meaningful step to reimagine what kind of America we want to build, an America where all people can live safely and freely. Thus, we must urge members of the Senate to support the passage of the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, to take it up and work to strengthen it.
I Can't Breathe should be remembered as the clarion call that caused this nation to rise up, speak truth to power, and bring about the change we deserve. Let's thank Chief Justice. Let's thank Jericka Richardson. Let's thank Dr. Porter. Let's thank the Honorable Congresswoman Karen Bass, and of course, Benjamin Crump, who I stood in for because they have just indicted the police officer in Minneapolis or in Brooklyn Center that killed the young men this week. And we will continue. Thank all of you that are with us. God bless you.
Thank you.
I'm good? All right.
March was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The pursuit of civil rights and economic opportunity were deeply intertwined, and it was clear the country was failing on both counts. In fact, if you looked at the economic data from the year before the march, 1962, the average black family possessed roughly 15% of the wealth of the average white family. That's more than a 6-to-1 difference, and it's stark. But perhaps it isn't surprising. Jim Crow laws were still in effect in many places. What is surprising, though, is that it's now more than half a century later, and that 6-to-1 number has barely budged. Today, African Americans remain unemployed at roughly twice the rate of white Americans. And that number hasn't changed much in 50 years either. It's as close to a constant as you come in economic data. Indeed, if you somehow transported my college economics professor to 2021 and you only showed them the employment and the wealth numbers, they would have a hard time guessing that the country had passed the Civil Rights Act, or that we had elected our first black president, or our first black vice president. Instead, they might actually notice signs that the country had headed in the opposite direction, especially after 2008. During the last recession, the highest white unemployment ever reached was 9.2%. But black unemployment was trapped above 10% for 5 years. It reached 17%, and it hit its peak earlier and recovered slower than unemployment for almost any other group. That is what economic crises do. They hit people of color harder and longer. They push our country towards more inequality. This past year, we saw it happen again. During the early days of the pandemic, African Americans were the first to lose their small businesses and their jobs. And as the economy opens back up, early data suggests that black workers will be the last to be rehired. Will this pandemic be yet another generational setback for people of color? When I took office, I really worried that would be the case. We know that when the foundations of someone's life collapse, when they lose a small business or the roof over their head or the ability to eat dinner every night, it can weigh them down permanently. Their ability to earn is forever lowered. It's a phenomenon called economic scarring. I worried this would happen on a mass scale, especially in communities of color. But I do not think it will anymore. Last month, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan, and I'm confident it provides enough relief for people to make it to the other side of this pandemic. In the end, it may still be true that the pandemic economy hit people of color harder, but I think the effects will be far milder than they would have been without the plan. But let me also say this. I know that's not enough. It's not sufficient that we just avoid an historic setback for Black Americans. On the other side of this crisis, we have to do more to unwind this sad, long history. The fact that for 50 years the economy has not worked well for communities of color, that we haven't yet lived up to Dr. King's vision. This is a profound economic and moral challenge. It's one I've cared about since I was in college, majoring in economics. and it's one I still care about now that I'm Treasury Secretary of the United States. For as long as I'm in this office, I want to work to make sure this economy works for everybody. I know we won't complete the job in my tenure, but my goal is that years from now, people see a difference. I do not know if any of you have children entering college or if they're studying economics, but my sincere hope is that by the time they are my age, and in fact well before that, they'll be able to look back at the economic data and see clear evidence that this country has made significant progress, and that progress started now. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, National Action Network. My name is Robert Rabin. I'm with the Diverse Asset Managers Initiative, and we are going to have an important conversation right now among some of the most influential leaders in the nation around asset management. The issue, and Reverend Sharpton was going to preside over this conversation. He right now is at a press conference with Benjamin Crump. You've just heard that they have indicted the officer in Brooklyn, Minnesota, and there's really no place that Reverend Sharpton shouldn't be. He will join this conversation as soon as that conference is over. We are going to discuss a hidden but profoundly important question of economics that affects all of us, but particularly African Americans. And that's the question of who manages our money. Some of the largest asset pools in the country, university endowments, pension funds, money that African Americans have contributed into these large pools. And then there's a real opacity around it. Who's managing the money? Where is the money going? Where are the investments? It's a conversation that Reverend Sharpton has really pushed forward, and we're excited this afternoon to be able to bring it to this wide audience so that people can hear what's going on and, importantly, what they can do. I'm going to allow each of the leaders to introduce, in this case, himself, and then we'll jump into a conversation. I believe that the comptrollers for the state of New York and the city of New York are coming on stage. I'll wait for them to get on stage, and we'll go to the folks on the screen. Mr. Smith in Texas.
Sure, Robert Smith. I'm founder, chairman, and CEO of Vista Equity Partners. We are an alternative asset manager focused principally in the area of enterprise software. We currently manage about $73 billion in assets under management and have a number of public pension plans as investors in our fund. We, in fact, cover over 50% of the membership of the public workers in America. These are teachers, firefighters, police officers, et cetera. And thank you for inviting me here, Bob.
It's great to see you. Mr. Vieira?
Hello, I'm Paul Vieira. I'm the CEO and founder of Earnest Partners. We're an asset management firm based in Atlanta. We also have offices in Brazil and in China. We manage money for a variety of public funds, corporate funds, endowments. And I'm also the founder of a company called Harmony Analytics, which is focused on a platform for measuring ESG for capital owners and for companies.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vieira. And Mr. Rogers, Chicago? Oh, you're on mute, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Robert. This is John Rogers from Ariel Investments in Chicago. I started the firm 38 years ago, and we were the first African-American money management and mutual fund company in the country's history. We currently manage about $17 billion, and we're focused on, like the others, managing institutional portfolios for pension funds and endowments and growing that way. But also we are really focused on our mutual fund family and trying to get our mutual funds added to 401k plans around the country and be one of the menu options for employees throughout the nation. So thank you. It's great to be here.
We're so glad to have you. And each of these gentlemen, as successful as they are, and they are number one in their field, Black-owned firms making enormous differences in asset management, they also are profound contributors to their communities and the nation. The charitable and civic engagement that they support is both a personal tribute to each of the three, but we're going to talk about it later. It's the importance of asset accumulation in the African American community in order to support the civic institutions that we care about. I'm going to go on stage to controllers in New York, Mr. Napoli and Mr. Stringer. New York State system and New York City system, we're so glad to have you this afternoon. I'll say just a sentence or two and then ask you gentlemen to introduce yourself, and then I'm going to ask some questions. You two are standouts in the nation with respect to public pension funds, absolute standouts in your commitment to diversity. You don't just sort of talk the talk, but you walk the walk. I will say in candor, you don't have a lot of competition. There aren't a lot of great pension funds around the country that are as committed as you are, but you set a standard that everybody ought to follow. So it's very, very important. It was very important to Reverend Sharpton, to these gentlemen on the screen, to have you today. We'd love to sort of just introduce yourself a little bit, but then importantly, go into, if you could, for a couple minutes about lessons learned. How did you get so, what we'll say, woke about the importance of including some of the most talented African-American firms in the country in your plans? And what do you have to say to your peers in pension funds about what they should be doing?
So I'll kick it off on behalf of New York State, and thank you, Robert, for that introduction. And it's great to see colleagues and partners on this call as well, and to be on the stage with Scott Stringer, New York City Controller. We share similar values and priorities, and it's been a privilege to work with him in advancing this agenda. So one of my responsibilities as State Controller is to serve as trustee for the New York Common Retirement Fund, which is the investment fund that invests money to pay for the retirement benefits of our 1.1 million New Yorkers who are part of our pension fund. And when I first became controller, certainly in that process, and some of you may recall I was appointed because there was a vacancy in the office, my legislative colleagues, Scott may remember, made the point that there was a real concern that access to asset management with the state pension fund was very much a closed shop, and that many firms, particularly firms of color, could not get to first base in terms of being considered to manage our assets. And one of the first people who visited me was Reverend Sharpton after I was appointed. And Reverend Sharpton said, you know, Tom, you got a tall task to restore credibility to this office, but one of the things you have to do is make sure that there are opportunities for diverse managers. So really from the get-go of my tenure, we made a priority for diversity in every sense of that word across the strategic priorities for our agency, including management of pension fund assets. And I'm very pleased that where we stand right now in 2021, we have about $20 billion of MWBE investments, and our emerging manager program, which is largely women and minority firms, we have close to $7 billion there. And our goal, of course, is whenever possible to graduate the emerging managers, which are newer firms, into the core of our portfolio. And just very briefly, and turn it over to Controller Stringer, our success, and by the way, we're not resting on our laurels, there's more that we want to do. Our success is very much tied to the fact that it's good business sense for the pension fund. Having a more diverse array of investment partnerships has enabled us to access markets that we frankly did not have access to. Many of our newer relationships, frankly, have outperformed some of the more traditional relationships that we've had. Certainly, you know, on this call, looking at Vista and Ariel with John and Robert, great success stories in terms of investment opportunities that working with their firms has given us exposure to. And the formula has worked, I think, first and foremost, because our investment staff has totally bought into it and has owned this as a priority. Again, because it's made good business sense. It's contributed to our returns and our bottom line. In my tenure, we've had 3 chief investment officers who've been incredibly supportive of this agenda. All 3 happen to have been women. 2 of the 3 have been black. They were hired because they were the best out there, the talent out there. But they really set the tone at the top of our organization to say that we have to seek out opportunities, cast the widest net possible. And so, you know, I'll just wrap up by saying what has been key for us has been communication, has been access. we do that in many ways, and we particularly put a priority on our annual Emerging Manager MWBE conference. This year we had about 1,000 people sign up for it. It was virtual, like this event is, but we really try to build relationships between our staff and the investment talent that's out there, those who we hire to manage our money, to make sure that they explain how the doors of opportunity are open, and we have dedicated platforms to provide opportunity, particularly for emerging managers. So a lot has gone into it. It hasn't happened overnight, but I'm pleased with how far we've come, and certainly there's even more we want to do, and we appreciate the opportunity to work along with New York City to advance this agenda.
Well,
Scott, let me say we are not here to go. Scott, I'm going to let you go in a second. I just wanted to say something kind about you. That, you know, obviously this is not a mayoral forum and we're not here to endorse, but I will say how proud I am that you have been such a leader on these issues, and that you've brought the importance of working with the most talented people of color as vendors, as business people from your office into this campaign. So appreciate that. But now let me let you say what you wanted to say.
well, thank you for those kind words. You don't mind if
That's fine.
it really is great to be back here at NAN at the 2021 virtual convention. And it's also great to see so many friends on the Zoom and, quite frankly, people I admire in finance, because if we're going to make real change in this country and if we're going to create wealth in all of our communities, it's going to take elected officials, business leaders, and community leaders. And like Tom DiNapoli, I do want to thank Reverend Sharpton, who over the years has made it his business to check in and make sure that both controllers are committed to wealth creation. And I am very proud to be recognized, along with Tom, as the two offices that are helping to lead in this country, but there's obviously a lot more to do. I just want to say, you know, for me, this is my last year as city controller. Term limits gives me 2 terms, so now it's going to be up to Tom DiNapoli. No, just kidding. We'll have a new controller soon enough. But in reflecting on the last 7.5 years as it relates to investments with black and brown firms, with MWBs, I remind myself that it was 7.5 years ago when I was getting ready to run for controller. I met somebody at one of the NAN functions who said, "I'd like to sit with you and talk to you about your campaign for controller." And we sat together for breakfast, and I'll never forget, the gentleman said to me, "You understand, as controller, you have an opportunity to create wealth in all communities." And I said, "Well, I'm new at this. Tell me what that means." He says, "You have to know that in the African American community and other communities, we don't have access to capital or investments. And the controller decides that. And we need to make sure that the managers who do business with our pension funds give opportunity to people to invest money and create good results." And I hope that over the last 7 years that we met that standard at that breakfast meeting. Because the truth is, so much of what Mr. Rogers, I think, mentioned was true. The reason that wealth needs to be created in communities is because when you create wealth, you also give back. And you also have philanthropy. And you also are able to invest in black colleges. And you also be able to invest in community organizations. And that helps the generations that come after. And as a member of the Jewish community, that is certainly true with Jewish philanthropy. It's true with so many groups that have had more economic opportunity, and we have to make sure that every community has that. So this is what I think is, in addition to protecting the retirement security of our pensioners, I would say that both Tom and I believe that this is probably one of the most, if not the most important aspects of our pension fund. And like Tom, we are proud of the work we've done. We've been able to grow our MWBs to $16 billion in investment. That's an increase of 88% over 8 years. And part of what I'm going to try to do is make sure that whoever becomes the next city controller, We've got to memorialize this commitment. We cannot let it fray based on who gets elected. It has to be part of the DNA of the pension fund, because we also know that when you have diverse people, whether it's at the corporate board level or in the C-suite or in the pension fund, diversity is a civil rights issue, but diversity gets better results. That's just a fact. If we had had more diverse people at WorldCom and Enron during the last financial meltdown, if we had had more people of color and more women on the corporate boards, life experiences perhaps would have dictated different results. And when you have all male, pale corporate boards, you also have groupthink. And I do believe it's important to put as many diverse people in the financial communities at the table so that we can get better results. And when companies do have diversity, we actually like investing in them because they make a difference. And so what I've learned over the past 7 years is that we can make change. Pension funds are powerful vehicles for change when you use them for the right reasons. First, you have to understand that you're a fiduciary, so merit and competence is important, but you also can change the world. One of the things that we see with Congress and presidents is there's always this logjam in Washington or in Albany. But, controllers and attorney generals like Letitia James, for example, can do great things by leveraging the pension fund for good. And I know that Tom and I are very proud of our work to divest from the fossil fuel industry. We're doing a $4 billion investment. That's a big deal for the planet and for all of our communities. People said that couldn't be done, and we figured out a way to do it. But we also are investing in the green economy, right? We want to invest in solar energy and electric batteries and use the pension fund for good. But the first line that we have to think about is how we become a more inclusive pension fund. One of the things we've asked some of our financial firms to do is I want to know who owns you. I want to know the gender and the race of the people within your companies to make sure that you are diverse, that you're not blocking women and people of color once they get into the elevator and that elevator stops before it gets to the C-suite or the corporate board level. And that is something that we have to continue to work on because that will create wealth in all of our neighborhoods and level the playing field for the next generation of young kids.
Scott, one of the things I love about you is you're so good and experienced about this. You don't need a question. You know what the country needs. Let me sort of shift us to something that I think you two are uniquely qualified to talk about. One of the studies that we incented shows, it comes out of Stanford with the participation of Lumen Capital, is some of the most significant bias based on race happens at what we call the top, at the elite performers. So fund managers that have been around a long time, have multiple funds, have a very strong track record. Interestingly, the study showed that some of them face the largest obstacles getting new pools of money from clients, from pension funds. And it didn't surprise me, but it was useful to see the quantitative study that showed that. So here's what we'd love you to sort of talk about, and you're not just talking to the NAN audience, you're talking to your peers and people who run pension funds and may listen to you. I've noticed with a lot of white people who overwhelmingly run the funds, the CIOs and the trustees, a real bias toward the emerging manager. We're happy to work with the young black woman, black man, Hispanic, Asian American, first time out, some millions of dollars, and we'll grow them. And that's great for the emerging manager. Everybody has to start at some point. But sometimes there's a real bias against the most seasoned firms, people saying that X has too much, or they have plenty, or they don't need my money. These are things that I've heard from white CIOs around the nation. Do you experience that? How do you think about that? Do you see a bias against some of the most seasoned people of color, and what should we be doing about that?
I don't know. I'm not sure that I've seen the dynamic quite play out that way, but I do think one of the challenges that we've observed is that gap, if that's the right word, between being an emerging manager and being big enough to be considered, one of the big players and ending up in the core portfolio. It's really, that's where we find a lot of the investment firms falling out of consideration. So one of the things we've launched this year is, if I could call it a transition approach, where we've allocated with one of our managers, and I'm talking about private equity now, I think it's a $400 million allocation, to target those who are too big to be considered an emerging manager. They've been around long enough and they are seasoned, but maybe not quite big enough to be in the, having a 10 billion or, plus size fund. So it's really trying to figure out a way to build that bridge, maybe that's the word I'm looking for, between being, a young, hungry firm that just started out and maybe not quite a mega firm, but how can we seed enough money to keep you in business to get to that point? So I don't know that I would use the word bias, but I would certainly say that the way that that the investment philosophy or investment approach has been structured, it has left some firms out of the gate when they've gotten big enough, but not quite of the size of some of the traditional big players. So in that sense, the structure maybe has been biased, and we're trying to create that bridge and create that opportunity. I guess that's what I've seen and what we're trying to address.
I would observe that what we're seeing, I think, around the country, and many of you on the Zoom would probably feel this better. There is a pie, right? And it's not unlimited investment dollars, right? There's a finite amount of investment dollars in public pension funds. We're two of the largest and the biggest, but we have cap as well. And I think there has been this feeling, especially in the big firms or white-owned firms, firms that do not have diversity as a strategy. They don't want black-owned firms to get too big because they see that there's a pattern coming to take away from their bottom line. And so institutional players are going to be institutional players, and the big guns are going to try to make sure that the emerging guns don't get beyond what they think is appropriate. And it really is up to people who run pension funds like Tom and myself to think of strategies to upend that, and upend it sooner rather than later, because the stakes here are becoming very higher. I've noticed, and I've been, quite frankly, shocked at the slow pace of emerging manager programs in this country, and it's because it really is an inside game. And Tom and I don't actually come from finance, right? We came into being controller from the government side. So for me, a lot of this was looking at it from the lens of, okay, how do we move things faster? We have a timeline, and it does get upended, and there has to be new strategies. One of the things that I think is a possibility now with President Biden is to start looking at, pension funds in the federal government, having somebody like President Obama who wanted to have a more robust conversation about that diversity. The proudest moment I had was coming to the White House to talk about our emerging manager plan and how we were sending billions of dollars into MWBs and emerging managers. This is now something we should focus on nationally with the Biden presidency, because all that was stalled under Trump, and I think we need a larger response if we're going to upend what is the traditional check the box of the MWB. Don't give too much, don't give too little, right? But don't try to really realign and restructure pension fund investments in this country.
I appreciate that, Scott. You just touched on what would have been my final question for you two before we go to the asset managers. The federal pension plans are obviously the largest pools of assets in the United States. And from my point of view, they are financial white citizens councils. They are almost completely devoid of people of color in any level of management. And that's notwithstanding years of drawing that to the attention. There's a GAO, which is the congressional arm study that points it out. It gave the pension plans failing grades with respect to diversity, but there's been very, very little done. I'm putting you on the spot, I know, but what do you think would be the most effective thing to do to crack what is literally a wasteland when it comes to people of color managing their own assets in the federal government?
I have enough trouble keeping up with New York. I'm not sure how to answer that
All
for
right,
the federal
we
government. But,
All
you know, I mean, I think in terms of the broader landscape, picking up on something Scott, you know, touched on in terms of federal responsibility and action, I think having a much more proactive role from the Securities and Exchange Commission in terms of collecting data and required reporting, be that of pension funds or certainly of investment firms that they regulate. I think, you know, right now, I mean, as Scott alluded to earlier, you know, we're asking managers to disclose, you know, who are they? What do they look like? It would be much easier rather than each pension fund asking all of their investment partners, you know, one-off doing an annual survey like we do, and I'm sure as New York City does, if this was required across the board. So I guess I would look to the SEC. I'm not sure that would get to have more enlightenment with those who run the federal pension system, but I think the SEC role could help us all in terms of promoting diversity.
Yeah, no, I think Tom, that's a very good point. You know, one of the things, just to segue from just pension fund investment to procurement dollars in city government, one of the things we did in our controller's office is we hired for New York City the city's first chief diversity officer, Carl Wallace, who many of you know. And Cara came into the controller's office to serve the role of what actually should have been a mayoral appointment. And one of the things we decided to do was look at the $23 billion of procurement spending. You know, the city hires law firms, accounting firms, hires food vendors, and shockingly, only 4% of those dollars went to women and minority-owned businesses. And Cara literally looked at the spend of every city agency and letter graded the spend. We gave the city a D+. We actually looked at the controller's office because people said to me in the controller's office, well, you don't have to look at your own office because, you know, we're in finance. And I said, well, maybe we should have more people of color in this office, right? And we letter graded ourselves. And once we started letter grading, de Blasio, our mayor, you know, he went a little crazy about this, right? And suddenly he had to respond to the letter grades. And we were able to get more MWBE spend. I tell you the story because I think on a federal level now, the federal agencies and the people who run those pension funds have to feel they're going to get their Sharpton call, or they're going to be held to account at a convention like this. Because I don't see them moving in the same way we feel we have to account as public officials because they're bureaucrats. And I do think the President of the United States, like President Obama, has to get involved in it. Bring the cabinet secretaries back to the White House and say, how are we going to deal with procurement and pension funds and investments? And I think that's something that we have to up the ante if we're going to really make.
Robert Raven, I came in late because we were doing something with the, they just charged a policeman out in Minnesota. But I did come in and hear Stringer say something about Mayor and Sharpton called and that he was going to triple the money he gives to blacks and women. Is that, did I hear him right, Robert? I'm just tuning in. Go ahead.
They told me the one word I can't use is the M word, mayor.
Well, I heard you say mayor, and I thought that was part of it. But go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't want to interrupt, Robert. I figured I'd make a, since you said a Sharpton call, I figured I'd make a house call and show up.
I'm doing a press conference with Rev after this. I didn't tell you this.
Go ahead, Brother Raven.
He froze.
Look what you.
He froze.
Oh, he's froze.
He's frozen.
Look what you did.
Technology.
Is Robert frozen? That's like the funds they've been giving black asset managers. We've been frozen a long time.
Up there he is.
All right.
All right.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So let's turn to the managers. Three of the most successful business people in the United States of America. You've seen it all from different aspects of asset management and financial services. Tell us a little bit about sort of where you think we are, both the entire field with respect to diversity, but your firms in particular. Where are we going? What are the challenges you face? And what should we be all doing to meet the charge, which is we're supposed to be maximizing returns, meeting our fiduciary duty for performance. How do we get to a point where so many of these white-run allocation systems are working with the most talented African Americans in the country? Go for it.
I'll be happy to start. And again, it's always a pleasure to be with this group. I do first want to say and congratulate first Tom DiNapoli and then Scott Stringer for the leadership they provided in this area. You two are heads and shoulders above the rest of the pension fund managers. Many are viewing your example and looking to follow. I would point to a couple of things that I think made it very successful. You know, in the case of what Tom has done is hired, staff from, Vicki Fuller, Nat Anastasia, Tatarchik, to actually focus with their teams, which included, people like Alcina and Goolsbee and others, to really focus on how do you drive capital into these efficiently and well-run private equity firms and asset managers. And in Scott's case, again, you mentioned Carl Wallace, who's just been spectacular. But I think one of the important elements as well is the hiring of Alex Donier and elevating him to CIO. And I think, one of the important parts is that these pension funds have to, reflect in their staff what their objectives are and what they want to accomplish. We at our firm, look to reflect that. Again, we have outside board members, and I'm looking at now about 60% of our outside board members are women, 70% of our boards have a person of color. So 60% of our boards have a woman on the board and 70% have a person of color. And I think, driving through, as you say, walking the walk through the staffing, the intentional conscious inclusion dynamics changes the way that these assets get allocated. And, like all things, we have to perform, which we do. And by and large, our statistics, and, Bob Raven, you can talk about that, perform. But we also have to have counterparts on the other side who recognize the importance of fueling our ecosystem of asset managers at some level proportionate to the payout or to the pay in to those pension plans, which I know Reverend Sharpton has talked about quite a bit, which is critically important.
I would chime in and say the following. First of all, I want to agree that both Controller Springer and DiNapoli have been exemplary with respect to what they've done in this space, and it's not easy for me to give out praise in this space, but in this particular case, it is due. I want to weave together a couple of things, a couple of questions that Robert Rabin asked. Earlier question about a Stanford study, and then most recently about sort of development and where do we see it with respect to asset management. And I make this sort of following observation, which is I kind of categorize the space in some ways as it's suffering from the bonsai effect. So if you remember these trees that can only grow so tall, they stop them from growing above a certain level. I mean, I think there's an element of that that's occurring overall in the asset management field, particularly as it relates to people of color and women. And one of the things that I observe is, you have to have targets, and you say we want to have X percent that are invested with, a certain kind of manager, and some people have 0, and some people actually have a target figure. But I think there's an effect of that could be debilitating, and it could look like this, which is if you set a limit, or you set a target, that becomes your maximum. And there's no reason that should be the maximum. And what often happens is you end up with scores and scores of managers in a very small allocation, and everybody gets a very small allocation. And the problem with that is, amongst other things, is you don't get the knock-on effects of developing firms so that they have the resources to be able to be, well, helpful in their communities, helpful with all the things that others on this call have cited, from philanthropy to hiring the best people, to mentoring the best people, to developing, businesses that have generational considerations in terms of that they can go on into the future. I think the other thing that happens is that I think the RFP process has the prospect of being highly discriminatory and almost nonsensical with respect to some of the things that are considered in it. For example, I heard earlier in the conversation that there was a gap between when you're X size and when you're 3X. That's a difficult space to be in. And I sort of make the following observation, which is I'm not sure why somebody who's managing 1 billion versus 10 billion, why is it that six billion is somehow in the middle and that they can't migrate to the $10 billion space? I mean, in a way, I think about it like this, which is why would a big pension plan say they don't want to do that? Well, they may say it because they'd say, well, we don't want to be too big a part of a particular manager's business. But that strikes me as paternalism that assures death, which is like you're trying to protect them with the chance that they may fail, and you may be the cause of their failure because you pull assets from them. But you assure it because you don't give them the opportunity to succeed, and you can only succeed if you actually, get in the game and get to prove that you've got the chops to perform. So, I mean, I guess I would sort of end the remark, which is like, look, at the end of the day, growing managers and supporting managers to whatever size, I don't think there should be caps on allocations on what they should be. And if you don't do that, you have the opportunity to get really outstanding returns. I know my two colleagues on this call, as in Robert and John, have really great returns. There's no reason not to give them and others money because they're doing a great job for the pensioners and the beneficiaries. And you have the ability for communities to do well over time, not just for the generation that John and Robert and I may be on the call, but on and on and on. It's the gift that keeps on giving in these communities. And I think we should aspire to that with respect to the vigor that we put behind this effort to try to make it really pop at this point in time. So I'll pause there and let my colleagues chime in or any other.
Thank you, Paul. John, what are you seeing?
Well, I would say a couple things. One, it's, after over this 38 years that I've been at Ariel and 30 years that I've had Melody Hobson as my business partner, Illinois had been the leader in diversity when it came to public pension funds. And it was something we were quite proud of. I have to admit that New York, sort of my adopted state, has more than caught up. The leadership that we've talked about today from our comptrollers has been so vitally important to that, and really leading the nation around this really important subject. And most importantly, hiring great diverse talent. People like Cara and Everett Clayton and Vicki Fuller. These are extraordinary people that make all the difference for all of us and are going to go on to make a difference for all of us. So I think it's something we all have mentioned and has had to reinforce that. The other thing I would pivot to is that I do think language matters. And I think we all have to, when we have progressive leaders like we have today in the room, understand that everybody will not execute the same kind of intent that our comptrollers do that are here today. What I've seen is the term emerging manager, I think, is problematic for two basic reasons. Less progressive leaders around the United States, when they hear the term emerging manager, they decide they're only going to work with small firms $2 billion or less, which does not allow many minority firms to ever get to scale. And every time you get a little bit above 2 billion, people seem less interested in hiring you. And it just really has not worked well for those firms that are trying to get us to scale. And everyone knows the $2 billion firm is not even a rounding error compared to Fidelity or Vanguard or BlackRock or Blackstone or whatever we're looking at. It's just literally not even a rounding error. And the other problem with emerging managers, is many progressive people don't understand, is that typically in many states, 80% of the emerging managers are white males. And if you look at Emerging Manager Monthly and you look at the honorees every year, the vast majority of the emerging managers of the year are not black. And so this term emerging manager has been very, very problematic when it's not in the hands of people that we can trust and know we're going to do the right thing, like what's happened in New York. The second terminology piece I think matters is, I've talked to my friends a lot about this, and you guys have heard me say this. The term supplier diversity is very problematic. You know, our economy, we all know, has moved to a professional services, financial services, and technology-based economy. And whenever, again, progressive people hear the term supplier diversity, they think about construction, catering, distribution, low margin types of the spend. And don't think about professional and financial services or technology, where we know all the wealth and power and influence today come from those three areas: professional services, financial services, and technology. Media is another great space to be in. So what the University of Chicago has done is they've taken the term supplier diversity and replaced it with business diversity. And in Chicago, our business leadership group is starting to use that term business diversity instead of supplier diversity to signal to people that we're open to do business in all aspects of the spend of any city, any state government, but also any corporation or any nonprofit, university, hospital, museum, to get them out of this habit of not using us in the parts of the spend where the true wealth and jobs are created. And then the final term that I would say is important is, you know, as an entrepreneur who started my firm with $200,000 from friends and family 38 years ago, you know, access to capital is important. But I tell people what was more important was access to customers. So when the city of Chicago hired us in 1984, our city treasurer Cecil Partee hired us, or when John Stroder, the county, hired us in 1985, or Howard University hired us in 1983, those early customers made all the difference in us being able to get launched. And so we have to start to realize we need access to capital, but most importantly, for those of us in professional financial services, we need access to customers.
So I appreciate that. Let me. So I think we have time for sort of one more broad topic. You gentlemen are successful, but even you face incredible bias. And I see it. I'm running around the country trying to get allocators to use more women and people of color. And the stuff that I hear is jaw-dropping. I've got the CIO of the University of Michigan telling me that he doesn't engage in social engineering. He's got an almost all-white pool of people, which seems to me social engineering. How else did they get to be all white? I've got the CIO of Princeton telling me he worked with an African-American and it didn't work out. I've got a CIO of a $10 billion family fund telling me that Mr. Smith has enough. I won't go on and on, I've said plenty. There's profound discrimination out there, and it's changing. People like DiNapoli and Stringer have done really significant work in moving this along, and Reverend Sharpton, you have been an incredible leader drawing attention to what pension plans need to be doing. What do you think works in sort of moving against this bias? What would you like to see us doing? And I'm particularly interested in corporate America, which seems right now to be the field that people need to be focused on, getting corporate treasuries and corporate pension funds working with more African Americans. What do you think we all need to be doing?
Well, I guess, you know, I talked about this, especially in corporate America, the language that I talked about matters a lot. Because again, 9 times out of 10, all corporations only do business with people of color in the supply chain area and the construction area. You know, we actually have data in the Chicago area from GDP. We have data from McKinsey and BCG that shows that most of the spend in the Chicagoland area is in professional services, with margins 5 to 20%. Out of the top 14 categories, construction comes in 10th with margins of 0 to 5%. So we've got to get them to understand that we deserve to be their investment banker, to be their lawyer, to be their accountant, to be their money manager, to have our funds in their 401k plan, and getting them to spend money with us in everything that they do. I think it's just a critical change that we have to have there. The other thing is, you know, Robert, we have a conference for African Americans on corporate boards, and it's been up 17 years. Charles Tribbett from Russell Reynolds helped us get it started. And what we do every year is we have a conference of the conference come and speak to our 300 directors that come. And it's been people like Harry Belafonte, late Congressman John Lewis, Andy Young, Reverend Sharpton, Reverend Jackson. You get the picture of these extraordinary leaders. President Obama has been there. But the theme is to remind us that those of us that are African American that are on corporate boards have a responsibility to fight for economic justice when we're there. Because if we don't speak up and, as the late congressman said, make good trouble, those white CEOs think everything's A-okay. You know, we got 2 blacks on our board. They're not saying anything is wrong. We'll just keep doing business the way we always hand out all the opportunities to our friends and people from our communities. So we have to inspire each other and hold each other accountable to stand up in these boardrooms and get in the spirit of Dr. King and the spirit of John Lewis and the spirit of Reverend Sharpton to fight for fairness there. And if we speak up and vote, you know, really speak out, we can change the course of these corporations and get them to do the right things, and also get all the universities and museums and hospitals that we help to fund, that we're on their boards, we can force them to do the right things for all of us.
Yeah, I'll tell you, Robert, I think it is accountability, as John is speaking to. You know, one, I think the federal government, you know, with a $1 trillion plus pension has less than, I think, 0.5% in the hands of diverse managers, which if you look at, you know, federal workers, we make up a whole lot more than 0.5%. And I think there should be some leadership. I think, you know, our leaders here on the stage from New York, again, are leading the way in the state of New York. There's other states that need to follow that example. And if they are not, I think that, you know, that the community needs to hold them accountable. If you're a teacher and 30% of the teachers are African-American in a particular county or state, and less than 1% or 0 are being managed by African-American managers, that's something that those teachers need to hold that group accountable for. And, you know, to John's point, you know, and I like what Comptroller DiNapoli did was to make a call to action for corporate America to make sure that the diversity of the boards, because it's those boards they're going to make a difference in, you know, who they're going to select and how that asset management of their pension plans are often getting determined. And so I think about it as holistic. It's an ecosystem. I think we have to start at the federal level. We have to get to the state level, and of course in the corporate level as well, to ensure that we have, you know, people understanding it's important. And if not, they need to be called out. You know, the gentleman on the stage have the ability to call these corporations because they are the shareholders, major shareholders of these corporations. Just like, you know, Treasurer Wooten is doing in Connecticut, and call those corporations and say, hey, listen, this is what we want to see. And if you're not doing that, then, you know, we will not invest in the stock of your companies or give instruction to the money managers who are in that space to invest in the stock of that company. And I think those are the sorts of activities that can be done in concert to drive more capital into the hands of a broader citizenry in America.
So we're still at the point, all of that is exactly right. We're still at the point where everything is, except for Illinois, which has some mandates, we're still at the point where it's all voluntary. The Securities and Exchange Commission has a diversity survey, which it requires of all of its registered entities. The last time I looked, about 1,600 entities that are required to be registered with the SEC, about 70 of them bothered to answer the diversity survey. And there doesn't seem to be any sanction for that. So we have a long way to go. I don't know of a single public instance, and I'll state this as a question. Do you know of an instance of a manager being fired or let go from an allocator because they declined or couldn't diversify? So there's significant increase in asking for diversity among managers, which is great. It's an important step. Do we know of anyone that's been let go? Has KKR or Carlyle ever been let go from a pension plan or an allocator because they couldn't come up with a diverse team? I don't mean to sort of call out any one company, but you get my drift here. We're not near the point where people are actually living the value of diversity as if it's a core value.
I think you're right to bring up that question, Robert. You know, as you know, Gabby Sulzberger has this data that talks about in the private equity world, the top 18 firms in private equity and venture capital have, you know, brought like 843 companies public roughly. And over all these years, in 843 companies, there's only been 29 blacks in the C-suite of all those companies that have been brought public. It's because people are not asking these tough questions and holding these large private equity and venture capital folks accountable for having diverse teams on their own teams and diversity on their boards, but diversity in the management teams of the companies that they've helped to finance and helped to grow. I think that's really critically important. We ask those questions. There are some, to your question, that are doing this well. The Knight Foundation in Miami, under Alberto Ibargüen's leadership, has done wonderful work around this issue. Bill Von Haney at Exelon, along with Doug Brown there at Exelon, are holding their money managers accountable for the diversity of their teams. So there are some people out there that are asking that tough question and saying, if you don't do the right things around diversity and inclusion, we won't do business with you. And as you know, just imagine if all corporations and nonprofits ask those types of questions that Knight is and Exelon is, we would have an entirely different look in the private equity and venture capital world.
I also think, Robert, following up John's point, is that we have to have government do that. One of the reasons we had Secretary Yellen make a statement as we started this is we intend to meet with her from NAN. People that are in these firms, white firms, should not be allowed to do business with the government if they cannot establish diversity. Because the reason that they are in office and appointed to the cabinets is because of our votes, yet we are not getting a return on our votes on the business side. They always look at us on the social side. We don't want charity, we want parity. We want to have equal business. I remember when COVID happened about a year ago, and they started coming out with all of these bailouts. It was Robert Smith that got on the phone with me and helped to push the Treasury Secretary of what was to me a hostile administration and got the little we got for small businesses. Government should be saying, if you do not have a good diversity plan and results, you cannot have government contracts, we cannot do certain things with you because the voters and the people demand that. And I think that these two controllers can be a model for that. And second to that is the labor unions. We cannot have unions that continue to have 60, 70% of their members black and brown, yet their pension funds are totally handled by all white. These progressive unions that come in and tell us we're to the left and we want this one elected and that, but they have lily white firm. They have lily white committees that decide who invests their firms, Tom DiNapoli. So, I mean, when you go to their membership meetings, it's just about 70%. You all go to get votes, 70% black and brown. If you go to their pension fund boards, it's like the Rocky Mountains. The higher up you go, the whiter it is. And this is got to stop. We need to say to these unions that you've got to show us that. And we're going to pick them out one by one and let their members know. I'm going to do a whole mailing to their members that you're being ripped off. Do you realize that developers in New York and Chicago, LA, major cities are borrowing money from pension funds to do developments in our community that are gentrifying? So grandma's pensions is moving her out of her own neighborhood and she don't even know it. So these are the kinds of things Nan is going to be coming out of here with, as well as colleges and universities. And this comes right down, city control, state control. These state universities, these state colleges, these people that we give deals to, museums, all of these nonprofits, where are they doing their financial business? We do not want them to just treat us like charity cases. We want them to do business with our business people so that our kids can get a job and grow up and own something and operate something.
Reverend Sharpton, you've just been fantastic at this. We have successfully opened up an effort with the largest 25 university endowments, the Harvards and the Yales and the University of California, and we had to work with Congress and you, Reverend Sharpton, in order to do it. But we've got them all putting out their numbers and talking about why they aren't working with women and people of color in their endowments, and that's great progress. I think the next step is to go to the largest 25 corporations and begin that same conversation. So I'm excited about working with you, Reverend Sharpton. We'll leave the asset managers out of it. You can't both be the problem and the solution. You all are the solution. but we will be launching an effort to get corporate America to pay more attention to these issues. Comptrollers, I'd love to sort of close out by asking you, since you're farther along this curve, what's the most effective thing? What creates the tipping point for leaders who are heavily, not completely, but heavily male and white in pension funds and other large institutions? Of all the reasons that you guys move, public pressure, it's the right thing to do, the studies show high performance, your own constituencies, what are the variables that you think are the most important to get your peers to become more like you?
I mean, I think to the extent that, trustees and fiduciaries at the end of the day have to justify the bottom line, I think the strongest argument is performance. And anybody that argues that having diversity reflected in your pool of investment managers hurts performance. In fact, our experience has been just the opposite. It's enhanced performance. So I would lead with the performance argument, and then certainly you could follow it up with the right thing to do. And hopefully we're living in a time where more people understand doing the right thing should be as much of a priority as the bottom line. But I think the performance argument at the end of the day for fiduciaries is important because, look, pension funds in their own way, certainly the public funds, we're often under attack as well. There are a lot of folks that want to move away from defined benefit pensions. That issue of retirement security is a big issue in this country that hasn't been adequately addressed. So those of us who are still part of pension plans where you get a defined benefit pension, and unfortunately for us in New York with the city funds that Scott oversees and the state fund, we're well funded. We've got the performance and the track record. And we've been able to get that track record by having an increasingly diverse pool of investment talent as part of our portfolio. So again, I think the performance argument is the best one, and then you can appeal to their conscience as well.
There's been a lot of argument or theories that, pension funds of our size shouldn't be managed by elected officials, right? Or we shouldn't have control of it. And as professionalized as we are within the Bureau of Asset Management and the work that Tom does with the Common Fund, at the end of the day, what I would say leaving this office is the people's pension fund, the people's retirement, should not be solely dictated on Wall Street managers for the reasons many of you articulated on the Zoom today, that this is going to continue to be a civil rights issue, and there has to be a government response. And as I reflect on it, at the end of the day, you got to do what's right. And when you get elected to these offices, you don't usually have a big shelf life to make a difference. And I just know for me, now that I'm an older dad, I have a third grader and a second grader. If this is church, people usually say, "Amen, how you doing?" I've raised them at NAN as best I can. But, for me, I want my two little kids to, when they go Google, when they get a little older, I want them to say, "Daddy was in a fight," right? I want them to know that we fought for the civil rights financial moment in this time. The way people before me came and did that, black and brown and white, and that's got to be the motivation. And if people like myself who run for office who are not motivated, then we need to have something called an election and get rid of people that don't believe in legacy and civil rights, and that's what we got to do. And when we stop thinking of fiduciaries, treasurers, and controllers, if we only are viewed as appointed officials, then the bad actors get in. And we have to pay more attention, I think, to who are going to hold these offices in this country. Treasurers and controllers control trillions of dollars. Is that right, Tom? Mm-hmm. And we should treat them like we treat the federal government, because a lot of them have boards like I do. Tom's a sole fiduciary. I mean, this is where wealth is going to be made for some and not others. And that's what I would leave you with today.
Appreciate you. Reverend, we've got 1 minute if you want to do closing remarks. Mr. DiNapoli, before you do that, Reverend, Paul Vieira is going to send you the Stanford Illumin study. We agree with you that performance is the healthiest conversation because everybody should be trying to maximize performance. But the study shows that too many white people don't believe the performance of people of color, even when the evidence is there. So we'll send you that study. Reverend Sharpton, you want to close
Let
us
me
out?
just say thank you for moderating this, and I want to thank all the participants. And I think that you ought to know, you that are watching around the country, that National Action Network is committed to really making this a priority in terms of accountability even more in the incoming year. We have an administration that is more friendly, but we need to make sure it's economically more friendly. We need to enforce that with the private sector. I'm getting ready to get on a call with a CEO now on an issue. And we need to make what is going on in New York and growing because as Tom and you, Scott, know, I'm never satisfied. Some of the people that you deal with are more satisfied than me. I always want to see more because we are undoing scores of years that were bad. But I also think that these latte liberals that claim to be our friends in labor and in government need to have to deal with this, and we need to target them and go after them, museums, nonprofits, all of them, some of these unions, this California teachers, all of these places, they're our friends. We are not looking for nicer, gentler slave masters. We're looking for freedom. We don't want friends. We want people to do business with us, and that's what this organization is committed to. And I want to thank our panel. Every one of them have been involved also in the community. This is not just about blacks and Latinos getting rich. Paul has been there and supported the causes that helps the community. John Rogers for decades has been there. So they put their efforts, their employment, their money in the community. Robert Smith, we just had all of the mothers of the movement here. We would not have been able to do what George Floyd family wanted to do if we hadn't had a Robert Smith and people that, you know, they have Nicodemus in the Bible that came to Jesus at midnight. I have midnight calls with Nicodemuses that are in black business that keep us doing what we do. And I want to thank all of them for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.